Hello and welcome to Everybody Podcast. I'm Daria Matza and I am so glad you're here. Today I bring you my chat with a registered dietitian, Aaron Flores. Aaron has a great story of taking a full 180 with his career. He goes from weight loss focused programs with veterans to his current health at every size approach. He's also a fellow podcaster. Aaron is the co-host of the wonderful show, Dietitians Unplugged. We had a great chat, and I can't wait for you to hear it, so let's get started. Well, why don't we just start by you telling us what's the work you're doing right now in the world?
So I'm a registered dietitian, and I have a few different, I'm sort of like a juggling act. I juggle a couple different things. One is I work part-time at an eating disorder treatment center in Woodland Hills called Center for Discovery, and it's a outpatient PHP an IOP location where clients come for, either like 7 hours a day, 3 hours a day, all different sorts of eating disorders. I've been there about a year, and I helped them create and launch a separate binge eating disorder track for those PHP and IOP locations.
I'm sorry, I don't know what that means.
PHP stands for partial hospitalization, and IOP stands for intensive outpatient.
Okay.
So for folks who are going through eating disorder treatment, it's basically levels of care.
Yep.
So someone who's intensive outpatient will come for 3 to 4 hours on maybe 3 to 5 days or 6 days a week, and someone who's in partial hospitalization, PHP, will come for 7 hours a day, and usually 5 to 6 days a week. So depending on what the current condition of the eating disorder is and the behaviors, sometimes they need a little bit more support, sometimes they need a little bit less. So it's basically what level of care they're admitted at.
Binge eating disorder is more newly recognized as something that needs treatment at that level. It feels like the momentum's building in that world to give binge eating disorder more importance. What have you noticed?
It came about, they approached me to see if I would be interested in helping them create, this separate track. And I jumped at the opportunity because you're absolutely right. It's, it's been around for a long time, but we're learning more and more about and recognizing more and more about the eating disorder, especially binge eating disorder, and what's helpful in treating it. And first off, not everyone who has binge eating disorder is in a larger body, and we need to understand that part.
Absolutely.
But the interesting thing, though, is having this separated track on some level where it is not all groups are separate, but some groups are. Is it allows these folks to share common experiences with their eating disorders that they might not have a safe space to talk about. So we do talk about principles of health at every size and intuitive eating, and we go into that, but we also really try to address weight stigma, and we do try to address weight stigma within an eating disorder environment. And additionally, how to learn to be an advocate for yourself, how to learn to set boundaries on discussions around weight, or how to have a conversation with the doctor when it comes to weight. So it's sort of giving these folks a safe space to address some other concerns that might not come up in other settings within our treatment center.
So that's really interesting about the eating disorder, and I'm so glad to hear that they've hired you. What else is it that you're doing? I know you have a lot of balls in the air.
So then I have a private practice in Calabasas, which is right next to Woodland Hills. It's a suburb of Los Angeles. So I see clients in my private practice. And then the other thing I do is I co-host a podcast with another dietitian. Her name is Glennis Oyston, and our podcast is called Dietitians Unplugged. And we talk about many similar things that I was looking at your guest list, and we've had very
I know, isn't that funny?
Similar guests. I love it.
There's definitely a circuit, it seems like, with a lot of our podcasts that are out there in the world.
And God bless that.
Yeah,
seriously, because what I find is when I listen to the conversation, even if we've had that guest on our podcast, I think the conversation that comes through on a different podcast is so interesting to me because they're different questions, it's a different feel, but also what I appreciate is I hope every listener is like listening to all these different podcasts, because hearing it in a different way sometimes helps us internalize it a little bit better.
Absolutely.
So I tell clients all the time, like, don't just listen to me saying this stuff.
Right.
Listen to other people who are saying similar things, but maybe using maybe a couple different words or a couple of different ways of saying it, because it might sit with you much differently, which is important.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We need like the story to be told many ways.
Absolutely.
I read that you've struggled with your body for most of your life. And I'm just curious about what is your first memory of that?
Growing up, as I look back on, pictures, my body was not drastically different. I sort of had this moderate level of thin privilege where I could navigate, my world as a elementary school and middle schooler without getting attention from my body, but it was something I noticed. And the things that I started to notice is that, just I didn't have the same musculature that other boys my age did. And I, it just didn't feel like as, my body didn't look as chiseled or as defined as others. It was just a little bit softer, and more, soft lines instead of hard lines. And as a boy growing up, I think this is probably, I would say, like in middle school, is even though it wasn't probably a big deal to anyone else, it started to feel like a big deal to me. So I think that was when I first started to really notice that my body was just shape-wise was just a little bit different than everyone else's and didn't quite fit the norm.
Whatever norm means.
Whatever norm means, yeah.
Right.
And yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And listen, I living in LA and growing up in Southern California, and I grew up near the beach, and there was a beach culture. I think that's important to understand. And the reason I say that is because there were a lot of days where you didn't wear a lot of clothes.
Right.
So because it was hot all the time, because we were so close to the beach, living in short sleeves, tank tops, wearing no shirts almost all summer was really common. And so if you didn't feel comfortable with your shirt off, you were sort of exposed to it on more than just like the summertime, because it's warm all year.
Right.
You can go to the beach almost all year. So it's sort of something that just crops up a fair amount.
Right. It seems like you didn't have the experience of being bullied for being a chubby kid or within your family dynamic. So at what point did you feel like the experience of being in your body became, I guess, more of a preoccupation?
Yeah. I definitely noticed it more in high school. And I don't know if it was, at the end of high school or right when I was going to college, but I remember overhearing my great uncle, and God bless him, he was a nice guy, but just had no filter, and I heard him whispering to either my mom or my grandmother, and he said, what are we going to do about Aaron's body? And I just sort of remember overhearing that. And I think it was around the same time that I went to see a dietitian and I went to this woman for, a few months, and, it was offered as a way. My mom had gone to the same dietitian and said that, going to her helped her with losing weight. So I went with this notion of losing weight to this dietitian. And again, I think those two things sort of combined really sort of illustrated to me that weight loss was something to pursue, that, having just the status quo body was not okay. And it was really subtle, right? It wasn't like, I think growing up as a man, it's probably a different experience, and a young man, a different experience than a woman. But to me, it felt very like there was like that subtle pressure that, oh yeah, you should probably try and lose weight.
What do you think I think that we could probably talk about this more as we get into later in life of your story, but I'm curious about this idea of shame that comes up with men, and specifically, I know when I interviewed Virgie Tovar, she talked a lot about how it's often that the men receive more shame almost because there's feminine qualities in, weight in like pursuing a diet. So not only are you getting fat shamed, you're also getting like, oh, you're a sissy. Look, you have to do that girl thing of dieting. Or I don't know if you ever experienced anything like that.
I think subtly for sure. I mean, I think it's not manly to eat a salad, right? Or to the stereotype is that you should be eating like meat and potatoes, right? That's what men have, big appetites. And so I think there's definitely a part of that for sure. The interesting thing is, I've had this sort of side project where I'm trying to have 100 conversations with men about their body image.
Yeah, I was so excited to hear about that.
And a very sort of similar thing that comes up is not so much being that notion of like the feminine part, but that there was never an outlet to discuss any of this. There was never a space where it could be discussed about body image, either that I'm struggling with or that I'm not struggling with. It was just like a topic that almost everyone that I've talked to so far, and I've done about 30 of them, they've all said like, I just never talked about it. It was never something I talked about with my friends or family or anyone. So it's just I kept it to myself. And then obviously what we're learning about shame is that the more you keep that to yourself and the less connection there is, the more the shame just spirals and takes over and leads to so many negative coping behaviors just to get rid of that feeling.
Right. That's interesting.
And I think that was true for me. I never, I really never had a space to talk about my body or the way I felt in my body with anyone.
Right. And so did you kind of head down the yo-yo trajectory from that experience, or what happened after that?
Yeah. So the interesting thing that happened is I really didn't do much of what this dietitian told me to do. To be honest, I was a teenager and wanted to be a teenager and didn't want to do any of the what I now know is eating disorder behaviors that she taught me. I didn't want to do any of those really. And so I sort of just tinkered with it a little bit in that period of my life. I went away to college and living on my own, as many people do, I really just let the food rebel flag fly, and I ate anything I wanted, and I was less active, and I started to gain weight in my early 20s. And right around like my mid 20s, I dropped out of school. I was living in LA and I was working, and in my mid 20s is when I really decided to remember everything that this dietitian taught me when I was, 15 or 16 and implement it all then. And that was really when I went, down the dieting path, pretty religiously. I mean, it really was a religion for me, at that point. And I was really strict about what I ate. I was really strict about how much I exercised. I thought about it all the time. I worked out, once a day. I don't know if I really did twice a day, but I definitely weighed myself multiple times a day. And it really led to about 2.5, 3 years of just like intense food obsession. And the interesting thing to me now as a dietitian is, as I look back on that, if we were to take all the things I was doing and get rid of gender and get rid of body size and get rid of any other personal identifiable information, it's eating disorder. I mean, it was an eating disorder, and it wasn't dieting. But I just thought I was dieting, really. When I look back on it, I probably, I was never diagnosed, but I probably had some level of an eating disorder at that point in my life, because it was so obsessive. It ruled my life. And it wasn't fun.
I imagine you were getting praise for it too. Is that fair? Because you were losing weight, I imagine.
Huge. I mean, I got praise from family. I got praise from, people started to flirt with me. I found out what I really got thin privilege back. I realized what it was like to navigate the world without anyone being upset if I sat next to them on the plane. No one stared at me if I ate alone at the food court, at the mall, on and on. I mean, there were just so many things that I realized that I gained some privilege,
right.
and the weight stigma went away. And that was the thing that messed. Can I curse on this podcast?
Please.
So that's the thing that fucked with my head the most.
Yeah.
Is because I was, internally just really struggling about everything. But externally, my life was completely different and being treated, differently because there was no weight stigma. So it was so hard to reconcile. Like, okay, so what's really going on here?
Right. Was there a moment of that time period that made it shifted?
To be honest, it took a while. I mean, I think I got less and less obsessed as the number on the scale began to plateau, and I realized I just couldn't be as obsessive as I wanted to be.
Mm-hmm.
It was just taking over my life, and I didn't like that. So I sort of backed off some of what I was doing, but also at the same time, I went back to school to be a dietitian. And so I was, still dieting, still, exhibiting all these disordered eating habits all the time. But I was miserable in my job.
Mm-hmm.
And I decided I would go back to school to be a dietitian. And I thought I was going to tell everyone how to lose weight. When I went back to school, that was my purpose.
Your desire to become a dietitian came from this experience of like, oh, I'm dieting and I'm losing weight. I could tell other people how to do this?
100%.
Okay.
100%. And, right? I mean, like, because now I'm, like, I've done a 180,
right,
completely.
Right. Well, I think it's interesting, though, too, because I hear so many stories about how many people that are in your field that are maybe have the same story as you, or they're coming from an eating disorder or disordered eating background and trying to kind of work through their own stuff think that becoming an RD is going to solve that.
Oh, totally. Well,
yeah.
I would say it's probably, very common.
Right.
I would say it's very common. Just thinking of the people I went to school with, the people in my internship, and the colleagues that I know. I for sure.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah. Okay, so how did that go for you?
It was really interesting. Like at first, it was going really well. Like in school, I was like, oh, this is going to be awesome. And this is like how I'm going to work. And this is what I'm going to do. And really what shifted is I began to work. Once I was done with school, I got a job at the VA, the Veterans Administration. And one of my, jobs that I settled into there was running a weight loss program. And
for veterans.
For veterans. Uh-huh. And so in that same period of time, I had also been re-exposed to intuitive eating. I was exposed to it a little bit at school, just the book. And I sort of opened up the book and read a few pages but not much. But then as an RD, I heard one of the co-authors, Elise Resch, speak at a local just professional learning day. And she was talking about the book, and I just said, I think I need to reread this book, or really, really read this book, really. And I read it, and it sort of turned on a lot of light bulbs for me. It really just sort of opened my eyes to both my experience, but also what these veterans were going through, because I had to, it was a weight loss program I was running. So they were coming weekly for classes. They would come every week. They'd step on the scale.
Wow.
They would, I'd have to record their weight, and the conversations that we had around just that 1 minute interaction were so interesting, because they were like, I don't know why it went up. I'm doing everything you told me to do. I don't know why it won't go down.
Was this mostly men?
All men, almost all men. Yeah.
Yeah.
And, just like, something's wrong with this thing,
right,
or,
right.
or
check the batteries in the scale.
Right. Or even just like, oh, I was really bad this week. I don't know if I want to get on this thing. And
interesting.
So those two things combined really opened my eyes that maybe this isn't the way I want to work with folks. Maybe I'm actually doing more harm than good. And what I did is I actually started going to Elise Resch's supervision group. She holds a monthly supervision group for dietitians and therapists in the area. And I went to that for like 3 years, I think, maybe longer. And for a long time, I just listened, right? But it was really like, in essence, like on some level my own therapy. You know, I listen and I started to internalize a lot of these principles and sort of do what I realize now is I was doing my own work in the area. I was really like sort of, that was me breaking up with diet culture. That was me sort of making peace with a lot of different foods and working on making peace with my body and sort of giving up the idea of weighing myself and having strict rules at home and all these things that were still sort of there, throughout this whole time. And so after doing all that work, I finally realized I can't do this anymore as a dietitian. Like I can't really torture these poor men and have them focus on weight. So that's when and then I finally quit the VA and started working in the eating disorder community, because it was what I realized is that was where that's where the conversations around food and bodies that I really wanted to have. Mm-hmm. They were in this world.
Right.
And I took another leap of faith and just dove in. And that's where I've been for about 3 or 4 years now.
Nice. Did you feel like you could have brought that work to the VA and shifted the program, or did you feel like it was too rebellious or extreme at that time?
Yeah. So I basically straddled paradigms for a couple years. I tried to bring in some of the way I look back, the way I worded it back then was I'm weaving in intuitive eating into some of these things. Mm-hmm. And the reason it really didn't work is I was one voice against many others who were saying something completely different.
Right.
So in essence, it really confused a lot of veterans, which I apologize for, because they were like, you're saying one thing, but someone else is saying another thing, and I don't know what to believe. Personally, it was too hard to justify, this approach, but also it felt icky. It felt bad. It felt, I was really feeling like, again, I'm doing harm. Like this is not helping. Like I'm actually making things worse by asking this person to get on the scale who has PTSD, who's suffering from, so many other issues, who has, is struggling financially and struggling, in so many areas. And I'm asking them to get on a scale and go buy organic fruits and vegetables when, like, really, that was my exposure to working with clients that have trauma.
Yeah.
And I'm so, and listen, I'm thankful for that experience. It's probably some of the most profound work I've ever done in my life and opened my eyes to so many things. Mm-hmm. Because, and one of those is how trauma affects our health, how trauma affects our ability to have self-care in our lives. And the thing it helped me connect to as I continue to do this work is how weight stigma is trauma.
Right.
And the shame that we feel in our bodies is trauma, and we need to acknowledge that in order to heal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Did you notice when you were doing those weight loss courses or groups that you were experiencing like the research that you know of now, that basically diets fail and, the whole kind of Hayes perspective? Were you noticing that in the men you were seeing?
100%.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Most people would regain weight, after they would graduate from the program. And even what weight they did maintain to lose, it was, not significant. It was like, 2%, 1% of where they started. And what's interesting is the program we were in, I was on these sort of it was a national program, right? Mm-hmm. I wasn't just doing it at the one VA. It's at every VA. They would have these national calls and they would talk about like, oh, but, they would try, it's all spin. I mean, really, it's like, no, but, even though people are regaining weight, they're not gaining all of it, or at least some of them. And they would say like, I forget how they phrased it, but it was basically like 2/3 are at least not regaining more weight. I was like, that's like really? Like, right. I mean, like that program reinforces every statistic that I've heard about weight loss, is that over time, the vast majority of people regain their weight over a 3 to 5 year period.
Right. Usually
So,
plus some too.
plus some, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Is that what happened in your own experience too? Because you had
Oh,
lost a bunch of weight and then.
totally,
Okay.
totally. I have, and that's, to be honest, that's been both a struggle and a blessing. I mean, I'll be honest, like there are times where I'm like, listen, I tell people, like, I'm a fat dietitian. Like,
Right.
this is just the body I'm in. And part of it is genetics and part of it is my dieting history. And I'm continually working on accepting that and working on being as embodied as I can, being as connected to my body as I can. And to be honest, I will say that I feel in many ways more connected and more comfortable in my body today than I ever have.
Mm-hmm.
And
great.
and I'm I don't weigh myself anymore, but my body is I've definitely regained a lot of weight from when I first dieted, and but I'm comfortable in my skin.
Right. And you're not obsessing about food in your body all the time.
No, not at all.
I imagine you must get some eyebrows sometimes when people ask you what you do for a living.
Yeah. No, for
and
sure.
not only you're in a field dominated by women, and then also that's true, right?
Oh, 100%. Yeah, I think I don't know what the current statistics are, but I think it's under 10% are men.
Okay.
And within the eating disorder world, it's even less. I mean, it's probably under. I spoke at the Binge Eating Disorder annual conference in November, and I was in one of the general sessions. So almost everyone in the conference was there. And I was the only male dietitian in the whole conference.
Wow.
So.
Well, yeah, I mean, when I think of the male dietitians I know, it's like, those dudes at the gym hawking protein powder or something.
Yes, I'm not. I hawk nothing.
You hawk haze.
I hawk haze. Yeah.
Yeah, that's funny.
So yes, I definitely get eye rolls. I definitely get some comments, and I get it from professionals, and I get it from the community as well. I've had therapists openly say, like, I tried to refer this client to you, but they saw what you look like and they didn't feel comfortable seeing you. And I get it just also gender wise, like some of the female clients say, like, I just would feel more comfortable having these conversations with a woman. So I get it from a lot of different areas, and I'm okay with it. Like I feel like what I find in my private practice and my work at Center for Discovery is that one of the first things I do with all of my clients is I acknowledge my body size. And I will tell people, like, I'm sitting here in this body, you're sitting there in that size body, whatever it is. And I just want to let you know that if you ever want to talk about it, or if it brings up anything for you, that we can talk about that, that we can, go down that road and have that conversation in a way that we're both comfortable with, that's not stigmatizing and it's not shaming, because to me, that's modeling how we talk around bodies in a way that we see each other's experiences.
Yeah, that's great. Have you had some experiences that have been really positive in that?
Absolutely. I mean, I think there's been some clients who will say, at first I didn't want to bring it up, but like, I did struggle. Like, I really thought, like, oh, Aaron in my recovery wants me to have the same body as him, especially for clients who are with smaller bodies. But and I've had clients with histories of sexual trauma, and it was really hard to talk to men. And what I found is that, in those cases, both of those cases, that, it can be just really healing to be able to talk about those issues that we think are most taboo or difficult to talk about with someone that you might not typically have that conversation with. Actually gets us down the road actually really far in some of that healing work that happens. And so it has been really great. I mean, and I think it has been really amazing because they get to, I don't know, one of the things I love about the work I do is that I sort of have no rules, right? I just I just want to, explore all these things with you in a partnering way, in an empathetic way, in a curious way, and we can do that any way that feels comfortable to each of us. And it doesn't have to just be like, this formal way of doing it. Like, we can do it in a lot of different ways.
Right.
And I think people resonate with that.
Yeah. I feel like the people that I know who are dietitians that have taken on intuitive eating and HAES, it seems like their work has shifted so much because most people don't tell people what to eat anymore. And it seems like it actually seems like to me it becomes more of an interesting job because you're, delving more into the person's story rather than just counting calories and, telling them to eat who knows what at the time. But
absolutely.
Do you feel like that shifts happened for you? Like that the work's become more interesting?
100%. And, I've done, I'm just about done with the certification program from Be Nourished, who obviously you probably know in Portland.
Of course.
So I'm in the second cohort of their Body Trust certification.
Awesome.
So it's been a 6-month journey of talking around embodiment and talking around what body trust is. And to me, it's provided me with this language that is so much more fulfilling to talk about in a session. You're right. I mean, to talk about, have X amount of exchanges of so-and-so, or, what was your protein for that meal? Or do you know what a carbohydrate is? I mean, some of that stuff needs to happen, right? But to me, I think it is so much more interesting to dive into really meaningful conversations around how food brings meaning to our lives, how bodies are, again, a taboo subject, and how, again, as a man, like to how a man can embrace feminist ideals and sort of expose patriarchy within an office that leads to like these conversations that I think 90% of my clients don't even think we're ever going to get to.
Right.
For me, it makes my job, 100% more interesting. It makes each day definitely challenging, right?
Sure.
I mean, there's definitely like
it's
hard days.
Of course. It's probably in some ways easier to just be like, oh, how many calories did you eat yesterday? Instead of, let's talk about your sexual trauma or whatever it may be.
Right. No, listen. And I think the way I would sort of put it is like those conversations like sort of touch the surface, right? I mean, they're sort of like surface level conversations. And again, when I sort of have conversations around exposing diet culture and exposing how, it is oppressive to people in larger bodies and how it is a way of oppressing female bodies, especially, they're conversations that are richer. They're deeper. They are conversations that really lead to an understanding that is so much like more profound than anything I ever would have thought of.
That's beautiful. Did you have binge eating disorder?
That's a great question. I would not categorize as that because I didn't go through episodes of binging. I think there were times in my childhood where I overate for sure, but it wasn't ever feeling like an out of control feeling. I think in my 20s, I was really just a very restrictive eater. I, had a limited list of foods I would eat. I would measure everything. I would, monitor my calories. So I was really more restrictive at that period.
So what has really drawn you? It seems like that's a real big area of interest for you now. What is it about binge eating disorder that feels like it compels you?
So a couple things. One is I feel like it's a conversation, or the way that people are having conversations around binge eating disorder are, again, we're using the wrong language. I think the vernacular that's out there is binge eating disorder gets lumped into a lot of weight loss discussions, and it gets lumped into a lot of diet culture discussions, and it gets really very stigmatizing for folks, because if you're not, on some level, if you're not losing weight, you're not recovering,
right?
Which to me becomes a big problem. And so I think the reason I'm drawn to binge eating disorder so much in my work is because, especially through all the body trust certification training, and especially through intuitive eating and health at every size, I think it's a language that like applies so directly to this disorder, and it's looking at getting away from how we view and how we judge our biases towards bodies, and trying to see the person, trying to really like see the person that's sitting across from me, and not the weight. And listen, we need to do that with our thinner bodied clients as well. Is to not just see that, their weight, but see the person that's sitting in the room with us. I just feel like there's less and less people to do that for binge eating disorder. I feel like there's probably, at least from the statistics, there's a higher prevalence comparatively to other eating disorders, but less people focusing on it in a way that's healing, and so many more people that are focusing on it in a way that's further stigmatizing.
Right. Absolutely. And what do you feel like is the most helpful tool in healing and unraveling that?
Well, there are 3 words that I sort of use a lot. And I think if I can help clients or anyone think about their food and bodies with curiosity, with self-compassion, and with empathy, I think those are like shifters. Those shift everything. And that if we can embrace those 3 words on a really routine basis when it comes to food and bodies, I think there's a lot of magic that happens.
What I'm hearing in that is like less doing and more just like holding the history, holding the space needed to let whatever's there be.
Yeah.
There's not like you need to do A, B, C, D. It's more just kind of holding the space. Does that feel? Yeah,
absolutely. The way that I sort of embrace that is, she was on your podcast, but when you interviewed Lucy Aframore for the podcast, she was in Portland. She talked so much about the wisdom that each person has about their own body. And that part of my job as a partner is to help them trust that wisdom. And to learn that wisdom or relearn that wisdom and come home to their own body's wisdom. And to me, that, like, when she said that, I was like, oh yeah.
Yeah, that's powerful.
Oh yeah. Like, why do I need to prescribe all the solutions? Like, I think we each have the solutions in ourselves. We just need help finding how to enlist it.
Yeah. And are there certain practices that you found really help do that?
Well, I think there's definitely things like, listen, the principles of intuitive eating are essential through all of that, and looking at those principles. I think a level of mindfulness is helpful. I think, like I said, exposing yourself to different voices or surrounding yourself with other really rebels in this area helps. If you're being bombarded with diet culture and I'm the only voice that is sort of ringing in your ear, like we need some other voices. I think learning to embrace food and moving your body in an enjoyable way as self-care is important. I think it's just learning to reframe some of these things that we've learned as that are meant to be like, punitive, black or white issues, and looking at them in very gray areas.
Yeah. Do you find that a lot of people that come to you with the idea of embracing intuitive eating still have that, but when I get that down, I'll lose weight behind it?
Yes.
Yeah.
All the time.
Yeah.
All the time. And I'm very upfront in those conversations, like, especially when someone calls me and says, I'm thinking of coming to see you. Like, what do you do? I'm very, I disclose right up front, like, I am not intuitive eating. I'm not going to use intuitive eating as a weight loss tool.
Right.
I've heard people doing it and it bothers me. It's not how the work is intended.
Right.
So again, when you talk about holding that, right, is I try to encourage, like, can we look at these principles and put weight on the back burner right now? And if not, then we got to like dive right in. Tell me about why weight is so important for you. Like, talk to me about what value does weight bring in your life? That's where the conversations start, because it might be framed as health, right? But it also might be framed in many other ways, looking at stigma, looking at thin privilege, all these things.
That's so interesting.
3 years ago, I would have said, no, we got to work on the food first, and then we'll get to body image down the road.
Yeah.
And I think what I'm toying with as a dietitian is, I think I've been doing it wrong, is that maybe we need to talk about bodies first and the food comes second.
Right.
Because it's really at the heart of all of it.
Sure.
Right.
Of course, everybody. Of course, it doesn't even it doesn't matter your size. Yeah. It's so interesting because I always thought being a dietitian sounded really boring, but when you describe it in this new way, it sounds like such an interesting job.
Yeah. Well, I listen. That's the greatest thing as everyone has ever told me. I love because it is. I love my job. I mean, I love going to work. I will also say that as dietitians, our profession is doing a disservice to other dietitians, professionals, because we're not trained on how to handle the emotional baggage that comes with doing our work. Yeah. And I think that's what I'm, just to be, again, disclose, that's the thing I struggle with right now is like, I give a lot to my clients, and it's sometimes hard to hold that space, and it's hard to juggle that with my wife and with my family. There's a lot of compassion that needs to go around, and I think as dietitians we need better training in how to support our own self-care in our work, and leave work at work, right? Therapists get tons of training on doing their own therapy or getting their own supervision. And dietitians it's just not as, there's really very little of that at all.
But do you feel like it's catching on that in the world of dietetics that this is the new way to practice, or the majority, it seems to me the majority of dietitians are still practicing in the old, eat this, count these calories, count these grams of protein way. What are you seeing?
I would agree. I think, I would say most people are living in that sort of more traditional paradigm, but I also see that within that they are embracing this sort of non-diet mentality and framing things as it's not a diet, it's a lifestyle change.
Right. The whole like wellness, but don't you feel like that wellness culture is still just I just had Sarah Vance on, and she used the great word shape-shifting, that it's just shape-shifting diet culture. Yes,
I agree. But to the layperson, it's not, right? I mean, it's like, this sounds different.
Right.
So I think the reason I point that out, though, is because I think for the dietitians internally who are doing that, I think listen, I was one of them. I didn't see what I was doing at the VA as a weight loss program. It was called a weight management program. This is about changing your lifestyle. So I mean, being in it, I bought into that notion that it wasn't a diet. Does that make sense? So like,
yeah, of course.
So I would guess that probably some dietitians who are doing that work probably don't see it as a diet either, right? They do see it as, no, we just want you to improve your lifestyle, or the whole wellness culture that has plopped up. The analogy I always tell people is that like I was in the Matrix, right? And Morpheus offered me a red or blue pill, and one of them puts me back to sleep and sends me off to dreamland, and the other one keeps my eyes open and I see how far this rabbit hole goes. Yeah. And I think I'm learning something new every day. Like I see things very differently each day, and I realize the more that the more I learn, the less I know. I mean, really, like I really think that that's true. I think I need to work on how I bring in voices that are not in the community into this room. I need to think about how all different gender identities are embraced in our work. I need to work on a lot of different things. But that initial sort of notion of, hey, there's something wrong here, or the relationships I'm having with my clients doesn't feel right.
Sure.
It feels very hierarchical. It feels like I'm up here and my clients are down there, and that doesn't feel right to me. I want to be on the same level. And I think all of this learning has helped change that level of relationship a lot. So it is. It's like, oh my, like I see the world a little bit differently. I do think of it as a rebellion. I think of it as, counterculture, but I think there's more of it and more of us each day.
Right. Yeah, that's great. You said you deal with food second earlier, and I wanted to come back to that and ask, how do you deal with food now with your clients? Is it a conversation, and what does that conversation sound like once you get there?
It's usually a couple different ways. One is I ask a lot of questions when it comes to food of how would it feel if I said X, Y, or Z?
Mm-hmm.
But I think I noticed that some clients will say, like, but I think I do. Like, I think maybe I'm lactose intolerant. Like every time I drink dairy, I my stomach gets upset or whatever. Right.
Right.
And so I sort of say like, okay, so how would it feel then if I tell you that you should avoid all dairy?
Right.
Right. Oh, well, geez. I mean, part of me might think of that, like you're giving me permission to restrict it. And part of me might think, at least you're allowing me to explore it a little bit more without judgment, whatever it is. But I think I try to say, if you want, I will give you the science part of it. Right. We'll bring that into the room. But I also want, after we talk about that, how that information connects to your lived experience.
Mm-hmm.
So questions like, so how does it feel? Like if we were to do this, what would it look like? What are the pros and cons of doing that then?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's so great. That's really great. Well, I don't have any more questions on my list, but I wanted to ask you if there's anything we haven't talked about or that you feel like we should add to this conversation.
No, I do want to thank you for doing your podcast. I love listening to it. And one of the things that Lucy said in her podcast that I continue to sort of think about and say, I'm starting to say either when I speak or with clients or whatever, is she says, would you have heard this message differently if I was in a different body?
Yeah.
And I'm really thankful to hear that in your podcast. I think I had to pull over the car and just let that, and literally I replayed that about 5 times.
She's a treasure, man.
Yeah.
She's so amazing. Yeah.
But I want to just thank you for doing the work you're doing. I really appreciate your voice being in the community.
Thank you for doing what you're doing too.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for joining me today for this episode of Everybody Podcast. I have a favor to ask. Most of you know that this week, Weight Watchers announced free membership to teens, which stirs up all sorts of feelings for me. Mostly a lot of anger and heartache. Did you go to Weight Watchers as a teen or another corporate diet program? I'd really love to hear your stories. You can find me at our website, everybodypodcast.com, Instagram, Facebook, or email at everybodypodcast@gmail.com. I believe with all of me that stories have tremendous power, and they're what the world really needs right now. I want to know you and your story, because this podcast is for everybody.